My name is Charlotte Whitmore. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, I would have described myself as a wife first, everything else second. Most people see me as composed, reliable, the kind of woman who remembers birthdays, signs the school permission slips on time, and keeps a marriage running so smoothly that no one ever thinks to ask how much effort it takes. I've been told I have a calming presence, that I'm low maintenance, that I don't create problems. What they really mean is that I don't make noise. For 12 years, I built a life with my husband that looked solid from the outside. A well-kept home in a quiet neighborhood, joint holiday cards, shared dinner parties, the kind of partnership people call stable. He worked in finance. I managed a small interior design consultancy from home after leaving my corporate role. We were comfortable, not extravagant, but secure, or so I thought. This story isn't about screaming matches or dramatic betrayals. It isn't about discovering a hidden affair or emptying bank accounts in the middle of the night. It's about something quieter, something colder. One evening, I told my husband that I had made a devastating mistake. I told him my business had collapsed, that I was drowning in debt, that we might lose everything. None of it was true. I staged financial ruin to test something I had been too afraid to confront directly. I wanted to know whether our marriage was built on partnership or on performance, whether love would remain if comfort disappeared, whether I mattered beyond what I provided. I expected concern, maybe frustration, perhaps a difficult conversation. Instead, that very night, he handed me divorce papers. Prepared, printed, dated. The moment I appeared to lose everything, he was ready to walk away. What shattered me wasn't the paperwork. It was the speed, the absence of hesitation, the way his face looked almost, relieved. This is the story of what led me to that test, what I discovered in the aftermath, and the quiet decisions I made once I understood who I had truly married. I won't exaggerate. I won't dramatize. I won't pretend I was fearless. I wasn't. I was terrified. But I was also watching, learning, and preparing. If you've ever wondered whether someone loves you, or simply the life you help them maintain, you may understand why I did what I did. Tell me, have you ever felt invisible inside something that looked perfect from the outside? To my husband, I was stability. Not passion, not unpredictability, not risk. Stability. When we met, I was working in corporate risk management for a mid-sized financial firm in Manhattan. Long hours, structured days, clean spreadsheets. I understood numbers in a way that made other people uneasy, because numbers don't lie, and I had a habit of noticing what others preferred to ignore. When we married, I left that career after our first home purchase. Not because he asked me to directly. He never said, quit. He said things like, you don't have to work that hard anymore, and we're fine on my income, and it would be nice if one of us wasn't always exhausted. It sounded generous, so I shifted. I started a small interior design consultancy from home, something flexible, creative, respectable. It made money, but not the kind that impressed anyone at his firm's holiday parties. When people asked what I did, I'd smile and say, I help families make their spaces feel like home. They would nod politely and turn back to my husband to ask about market forecasts. To his colleagues, I was lucky. To our neighbors, I was sweet. To his mother, I was practical. She said that once at Thanksgiving, as though it were a compliment. Charlotte is practical. She keeps everything together. That was my assigned identity. I organized our finances, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. I tracked expenses, investments, and tax schedules. I created long-term savings models. I reviewed documents before he signed them, quietly, without fanfare. At dinner parties, I refilled glasses. I remembered dietary restrictions. I smoothed over awkward pauses. If he interrupted me mid-sentence, which he often did, it was framed as enthusiasm. Sorry, Shah. Go on, he'd say, already continuing his own point. I would let it go. Because none of it was cruel. Not obviously. Not dramatically. It was just consistent. When something broke in the house, I handled it. When his parents needed help navigating insurance paperwork, I handled it. When he had a stressful quarter, I reduced my client load so I could be present. No one asked whether I was stressed. Over time, I realized something unsettling. I had become infrastructure. Necessary, functional, invisible. Like plumbing, you only notice it when it fails. If I was tired, I didn't show it. If I felt dismissed, I told myself it was minor. Marriage, I believed, was about endurance, about being the steady one when the other person was ambitious, distracted, or building something. I thought my quiet competence was a strength, and in many ways it was. But what I didn't see, what I refused to see, was how easily stability can be mistaken for replaceability. Because when you are always calm, when you never demand reassurance, when you absorb inconvenience without protest, people start to believe you require nothing. And the dangerous thing about being perceived as someone who needs nothing is that others begin to feel entitled to give you exactly that. The first crack in something rarely sounds like a crack. It sounds like laughter. It was a Friday evening at one of his firm's quarterly dinners. The kind hosted at a restaurant where the lighting is flattering and the prices are never listed without decimals. I wore a navy silk dress, simple, structured, something that made me feel like myself. Polished, but not ornamental. Halfway through the second course, one of his colleagues asked how the housing market shifts were affecting little boutique designers. It was phrased lightly, playfully. Before I could answer, my husband chuckled. "Oh, Charlotte doesn't really worry about market volatility," he said, waving his hand as if dismissing a child's science fair project. "She just makes things look pretty. I handle the real risk." There was laughter around the table. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was the comfortable kind, the kind that signals everyone understands the hierarchy. I smiled. I even nodded. But inside something tightened, because risk management had once been my field, because I had built financial models before he ever did, because I still reviewed our investment portfolios every quarter while he skimmed summaries. But I didn't correct him. I told myself it wasn't worth embarrassing him, that he was just simplifying, that social settings require shorthand versions of reality. Later that night, in the car, I mentioned it gently. "You know," I said, keeping my tone neutral, "I used to manage risk too." He sighed, an almost imperceptible exhale. "Shah, don't be sensitive. They were joking. You know how these dinners are." Sensitive. That word stayed with me longer than the comment at the table. Sensitive meant overreacting, misinterpreting, taking something harmless and inflating it. So I folded the moment neatly and placed it somewhere in the back of my mind. But I didn't forget it. A week later, I noticed something else. He had made a sizable adjustment to one of our joint investment allocations without telling me. It wasn't reckless, just unnecessary. And when I asked why he hadn't mentioned it, he shrugged. "I didn't think it was a big deal. We had always discussed major shifts before. I just thought we were a team on that," I said. "We are," he replied quickly. "I just didn't think you'd want to get into the weeds." The weeds. That's where I had built my entire career. Again, nothing dramatic, no shouting, no slammed doors, just small recalibrations of respect. I began to notice a pattern, not of hostility, but of minimization. If I expressed concern, I was reassured I was overthinking. If I offered analysis, it was interesting, but not decisive. If I questioned something, it was framed as emotional rather than logical. And because I valued harmony, I kept adjusting. Maybe I was too quiet at those dinners. Maybe I should assert myself more. Maybe this was simply the evolution of long marriages, roles, solidifying. The first small cut isn't meant to wound deeply. It's meant to test how much you'll tolerate without bleeding visibly. I didn't bleed. I smiled. I adapted. I stayed steady. But somewhere in the quiet, I began keeping a different kind of record. Not just numbers in my ledger, but moments. Tone shifts, word choices, decisions made without me. Not to build a case, just to understand. Because something in me, something analytical and patient, had started asking a question I wasn't ready to voice out loud. If I stopped being useful, would I still be valued? The human mind is remarkably skilled at reframing discomfort as normalcy. After that dinner, I told myself it had been harmless. After the investment shift, I told myself it had been practical. Marriage, I reasoned, wasn't about keeping score. It was about choosing peace over pride. So I chose peace. What I didn't realize was that every unchallenged dismissal quietly redraws the boundary of what is acceptable. It began showing up in smaller, almost invisible ways. He would recap our weekend plans to friends as if they were his ideas. He would reference financial strategies I had drafted as something I've been thinking about. He began describing my work as a hobby that pays for itself. Each comment was light, casual, said with a smile. And each time, I hesitated for half a second, long enough to feel the sting, short enough to swallow it. Because correcting him would create awkwardness. And awkwardness in my mind was a greater threat than misattribution. There's a subtle shift that happens when someone repeatedly downplays you. You begin to question whether your memory of events is inflated, whether your contribution was smaller than you believed, whether you're clinging to significance that no longer exists. One afternoon, I overheard him on the phone with a colleague in his home office. "If things ever tightened up," he said, almost laughing, "I'd just have to carry us for a while. Charlotte's business is cute, but it's not exactly recession-proof." Cute. That word again. I stood in the hallway longer than I needed to. Not because I was shocked, but because I wasn't. That was the moment I understood something quietly devastating. This wasn't accidental. It was structural. I had slowly been repositioned in our marriage narrative. From equal partner to supportive accessory. From strategist to decorator. From co-pilot to passenger. And because I never raised my voice, because I never demanded recognition, the shift had occurred without resistance. But here's the truth I rarely admit. I helped create that version of me. I made myself convenient. I managed everything before it became a problem. I anticipated his needs before he articulated them. I smoothed out conflicts so efficiently that he rarely had to confront discomfort. In doing so, I unintentionally trained him to believe I required nothing in return. The normalization wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with cruelty. It arrived wrapped in efficiency. "You're just better at that stuff. You don't need the spotlight. You're so low drama." Low drama became synonymous with low priority. And because nothing catastrophic was happening, no betrayal, no financial crisis, no public humiliation, I convinced myself it wasn't serious. But the body keeps a different kind of ledger. I noticed I was speaking less at gatherings. I noticed I deferred to him before finishing my own sentences. I noticed I had stopped sharing long-term goals for my business because he responded with polite distraction. I began shrinking in places where I used to stand evenly, and yet I remained calm. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The house still ran smoothly. The accounts were still balanced. The dinners were still hosted flawlessly. But inside, I was conducting a quiet audit. Not of money, of respect. And the numbers were beginning to tell a story I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can no longer pretend it's random. And once you recognize that someone sees you as supplementary, you must eventually decide whether you will remain that way. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you're no longer being seen as who you are, but as to who you consistently perform. For me, that realization came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. His mother had called the night before, anxious about an insurance letter she didn't understand. Of course, I handled it. I always handled it. I spent 2 hours reviewing the policy, drafting an appeal, and scheduling a follow-up call. The next day, he mentioned it casually while putting on his watch. "Thanks for taking care of that. You're just good at that kind of thing." That kind of thing. Paperwork, logistics, cleanup. I watched him in the mirror as he adjusted his tie. Confident, composed, already mentally somewhere else. And suddenly, it became painfully clear. In his world, I was operations. I was the quiet department that ensured everything functioned without interruption. The invisible team that absorbs complexity so leadership can focus on vision. Reliable, useful, efficient, interchangeable. I had been assigned the role of the stabilizer. At dinner parties, I noticed how he introduced me. "This is Charlotte. She keeps our life organized." Not, "She used to run risk analysis for a Manhattan firm." Not, "She built her own consultancy from the ground up." Not, "She's the reason our long-term investments are structured the way they are." He framed me as support, and I had allowed it, because part of me believed that strong women don't need validation, that confidence is silent, that recognition is optional. But there's a difference between not needing applause and being systematically reduced. The role I was assigned came with expectations. Be agreeable, be steady, don't complicate things, don't compete. When financial conversations arose in group settings, he naturally took the lead. If I added nuance, he'd summarize over me. If I disagreed gently, he'd reframe it as a different perspective, as though mine were theoretical and his was authoritative. I started noticing how often he used phrases like, "Charlotte doesn't really get into the heavy stuff." It was subtle branding, and branding, when repeated enough, becomes identity. The most unsettling part wasn't his behavior. It was my adaptation. I began editing myself preemptively, shortening explanations, softening expertise, avoiding corrections, because harmony had become my priority. But harmony built on imbalance isn't peace. It's a quiet erosion. One evening, while organizing documents in my home office, I opened my old corporate performance reviews, objective metrics, leadership notes, risk projections I had authored years before we married. The language was starkly different from how I was now described. Strategic, decisive, analytical. I ran my fingers over the printed pages and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not resentment. Clarity. I wasn't being misunderstood. I was being redefined. And once you recognize the role you've been placed into, you have two choices. Lean into it fully, or step outside it and risk destabilizing everything. At that point, I still wasn't ready to destabilize anything. But I had stopped pretending the assignment was accidental. It was convenient. For him. The question I hadn't yet asked was if my value in this marriage was rooted in stability, what would happen if that stability disappeared? The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a betrayal. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, with sunlight coming through the kitchen windows and the faint sound of the dishwasher humming in the background. He was at the counter reviewing market reports on his tablet. I was across from him, updating projections for one of my clients, small business owners renovating a property they had nearly lost during the pandemic. I had helped them restructure their cash flow. It was delicate work, precise. He glanced up at one point and asked, almost absent-mindedly, "Do you think you'll ever scale that little operation of yours?" Little operation! There was no malice in his voice, just curiosity layered with mild condescension, so natural he didn't even register it. "I could," I said evenly, "if I wanted to." He nodded vaguely. "It's nice you don't have that pressure." That was the moment. Not because of what he said, but because of what I felt. There was no sting this time, no tightening in my chest, no reflex to rationalize. There was distance. For the first time, I heard him the way an outsider would. Not as my husband, not as my partner, but as a man describing a woman he viewed as secondary in ambition, secondary in risk, secondary in consequence. And I realized something quietly devastating. He believed he was carrying us, financially, strategically, existentially. He believed that if anything ever went wrong, he would be the one holding everything together. Not because I had failed, but because he had slowly rewritten the narrative to position himself as the backbone. I watched him scroll through his tablet, confident in his importance. And I asked myself, without emotion, what would he do if that story collapsed? If I was suddenly not stable, not steady, not financially neutral, if I became the liability instead of the asset? The idea didn't come as revenge. It came as an inquiry. Not to trap him, but to measure him. For years I had been measuring myself, adjusting tone, adjusting expectations, adjusting presence. That afternoon I stopped adjusting. Instead I observed, how often did he check in about my work beyond surface politeness? How often did he consult me before major financial decisions? How often did he frame our success as shared rather than singular? The answers were uncomfortably consistent. Later that evening, as we sat on the couch, he mentioned a colleague whose wife had made some disastrous business choices. "She put them in a terrible position," he said. "I don't know how you recover from that kind of irresponsibility." I studied his expression carefully. There was no fear in it, just judgment. And I understood something with startling clarity. He respected strength. He valued success. He admired financial stability. But I wasn't entirely sure he loved vulnerability, or sacrifice, or failure. And marriage, real marriage, eventually requires all three. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in my home office with my black leather ledger open in front of me. I didn't write numbers. I wrote a question. If I lose everything tomorrow, does he stay? That was the day something shifted. Not in him, in me. Because once a question like that takes root, it doesn't disappear. It waits. And eventually, it demands an answer. After that Sunday, I stopped correcting the narrative. Not because I agreed with it, because I wanted to see how far it would go without resistance. There's a difference between passive silence and strategic silence. Passive silence is rooted in fear. Strategic silence is rooted in observation. For years, I had been the first kind. Now I have become the second. When he made minor financial adjustments without consulting me, I didn't question them. I simply noted them. When he introduced me as the creative one at social gatherings, I smiled and let the label settle in the room. When conversations drifted toward risk, investments, or economic forecasts, I allowed him to take the lead without adding nuance. And something interesting happened. He grew more confident, more expansive. Without my subtle calibrations, his assumptions went unchallenged. He began making broader claims, speaking with greater certainty, predicting markets with causal authority. He believed the absence of my input meant agreement. It did not. At home, I began pulling back in quieter ways. I no longer volunteered to review every document. I stopped preemptively flagging tax deadlines unless asked. I reduced the number of background systems I managed invisibly. Nothing catastrophic, nothing negligent, just enough space for him to carry what he believed he was already carrying. He didn't notice at first. Why would he? Infrastructure is invisible until it falters. Meanwhile, I resumed something I hadn't done in years. I studied. Late at night, after he went to bed, I revisited financial modeling frameworks. I updated myself on regulatory changes. I reviewed our full portfolio structure, not from the perspective of support, but from the perspective of autonomy. I began separating knowledge from marriage. If I had to stand alone tomorrow, could I? The answer was yes, and that realization was strangely calming. Strategic silence also revealed something else. How much of our dynamic was sustained by my proactive smoothing. When small inconveniences arose, an overlooked bill, a scheduling conflict, a minor miscalculation, he reacted with mild frustration. Not panic, not a crisis, just an annoyance. "You didn't catch that?" he asked once, surprised. I met his eyes evenly. I didn't know it needed catching. He blinked, then nodded slowly. It wasn't a confrontation. It was calibration. Over the next few weeks, I watched carefully. He enjoyed being the decisive one, the steady one, the architect of our security. And I let him, because I was no longer trying to prove my value. I was assessing his. Silence, when used intentionally, becomes a mirror. Without my constant reinforcement, I began to see him more clearly. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't reckless, he wasn't malicious, but he was comfortable. Comfortable believing that love was stable because the system was stable. Comfortable assuming that my quiet presence meant I would always absorb shock. What he never considered was this. Silence doesn't always mean acceptance. Sometimes it means preparation. And by then, I had already begun preparing for the question that still sat in my ledger. If I appear to lose everything, who does he choose to be? Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. That was the advantage. From the outside, nothing about my life changed. I still hosted dinners, still attended charity luncheons, still responded to his colleagues' spouses with warmth and efficiency. If anything, I appeared calmer, quieter, almost softer. No one notices a woman who becomes slightly more composed. What they don't see is where that composure is directed. Every morning, after he left for work, I sat in my home office with my leather ledger and began mapping reality without emotion. Assets, liabilities, liquidity, exposure. Not because we were in danger, because I wanted to know exactly how much of our security was perception and how much was structural. I reviewed every joint account, every investment, every shared obligation. I traced which accounts required 2 signatures and which required 1. I noted how quickly funds could be moved, how quickly could they be frozen. I wasn't planning anything illegal. I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I was building clarity. At the same time, I quietly expanded my consultancy. Not publicly, not in a way that would draw attention. I reached out to former corporate contacts under the guise of catching up. I accepted 2 higher-value clients outside our immediate social circle. I increased my rates slightly, just enough to test elasticity. They didn't flinch. That told me something important. My business wasn't cute. It had been under-leveraged. In the evenings, while he scrolled through financial news, I updated certifications I had let lapse. I enrolled in a short advanced risk analytics course under my maiden name. No announcement, no discussion. He never asked what I was studying. He assumed it was design software, and I let him assume. I also began documenting conversations more deliberately, not in a way that would be used against him, but in a way that would prevent me from gaslighting myself. Dates, comments, shifts in tone. There's a strange power in writing things down. It removes ambiguity. It transforms feelings into data. And the data was consistent. He equated worth with performance. He equated stability with love. He equated financial strength with authority, which meant if those pillars cracked, his behavior would reveal itself quickly. I tested small scenarios first. One week I mentioned that a client's payment might be delayed. I watched his reaction closely. "How delayed?" he asked immediately. "Maybe a month." He frowned. Not in concern for me, but in recalculation. "Well, make sure that doesn't snowball." Make sure, as though I were a junior associate who needed supervision. Another evening, I casually brought up a hypothetical. If my business ever failed completely, I asked, stirring tea. Would you see that as my personal failure? He didn't look up from his laptop. It would depend on why it failed, he said. But we'd have to be realistic about what that meant. Realistic? I didn't push further, because by then I already understood. What he never noticed, was that I was no longer reacting emotionally to his answers. I was categorizing them. Emotionally, something had cooled, not into resentment, into precision. I wasn't angry. I was calibrating. I began separating my personal savings more distinctly. Still legal, still transparent within the boundaries of our agreements, but structured in a way that gave me independent mobility. I met quietly with a financial advisor, framed as expanding my business portfolio, which was true. I asked neutral questions about asset protection, about divorce law in Connecticut, about how courts evaluate long-term marital contributions, not because I planned to leave, because I needed to know the terrain. Preparation is not betrayal, it is self-respect. At night, when he fell asleep easily beside me, I would sometimes study his face in the dark, calm, certain, confident in the solidity of the life he believed he commanded. He had no idea that the solidity he admired was built on two pillars, and that one of them was reconsidering her position. The most dangerous shift in any dynamic isn't anger, it's awareness. By the time I finished preparing, I no longer needed reassurance. I needed confirmation, and I knew exactly how I was going to get it. The leverage didn't arrive as a discovery. It arrived as recognition. One Thursday afternoon, I was reviewing our consolidated portfolio report, something I had continued doing quietly, even after stepping back from active management. I wasn't searching for flaws, I was studying structure. That's when I saw it clearly. Nearly 60% of our long-term stability, retirement allocations, tax-optimized holdings, staggered bonds, had been originally structured under models I built years ago. Before I left corporate, before my consultancy, before the narrative shifted. He had adjusted them over time, yes, rebalanced them, rebranded them in conversation as our current strategy. But the foundation? Mine. The risk buffers that protected us during volatile quarters? Mine. The diversification model that reduced our exposure during downturns? Mine. The tax loss harvesting sequence that impressed his colleagues when he mentioned it at dinners? Mine. He wasn't incompetent. He simply believed the story he preferred, that he was the architect, and I was the assistant. I leaned back in my chair and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Stillness. Not triumph, not anger. Clarity. Because leverage isn't about domination. It's about knowing the truth of your position. If I withdrew my insight completely, if I stopped anticipating, modeling, adjusting, he would still function, but not as seamlessly. And if I disrupted the perception of my stability, if I introduced the idea that I had become financially vulnerable, his reaction would reveal everything. The private reveal wasn't to him, it was to myself. I didn't need to test whether I was capable. I didn't need to test whether I could stand alone. I could. What I needed to test was whether his love had ever been independent of my utility. That night, I opened my ledger and outlined the scenario. Not melodramatic, not chaotic. Controlled. I would tell him my business had collapsed, that I had miscalculated expansion costs, that debt had accumulated faster than projected, that legal notices might follow. Believable, not catastrophic enough to ruin us, but significant enough to destabilize the narrative. I rehearsed the tone. No tears, no hysteria, no dramatics, just a quiet admission. I made a mistake. I even calculated what kind of debt would feel plausible without triggering external legal consequences. This wasn't about fraud or criminal risk. It was about perception. The perception that I was no longer the steady one. I spent the next week observing him even more carefully. He was particularly confident that week, closing a deal, discussing bonuses, projecting next year's gains. He said at dinner one night, almost proudly, "It's good that one of us always has a firm grip on reality." One of us? I nodded slowly, because what he didn't know was this. Reality was about to shift. The private reveal also forced me to confront something uncomfortable. What if he stayed? What if he surprised me? What if he responded with partnership, calm, reassurance? I had to be prepared for that too, because this wasn't about punishing him. It was about truth. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to understand. On the afternoon I chose, I dressed simply. No dramatic cues, no visual signals that something was wrong. I waited until evening, when he was relaxed, receptive, comfortable in the illusion of solidity. I felt no adrenaline, only precision, because once spoken, the scenario could not be undone. Even if I revealed the truth later, the first reaction would be real. Instinctive. And instinct doesn't lie. I closed my ledger that afternoon with one final note. When stability disappears, character appears. That night, I would find out who my husband truly was. The evening felt painfully ordinary. That was important. If there had been tension in the air, if my voice had trembled or my movements had shifted, he might have braced himself emotionally. Instinct is sharp when it senses drama, so I gave him none. Dinner was simple: roasted chicken, a glass of wine. The dishwasher was humming in the background like it always did. He talked about a colleague angling for a promotion. I listened, nodding in the right places. Then, when the plates were cleared and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, I said his name. Not sharply, not softly, just evenly. "There's something I need to tell you." He looked up immediately, not alarmed, just mildly attentive. "Okay?" I sat across from him at the dining table. No theatrics, no pacing. "My business isn't stable," I began. "I made an expansion decision earlier this year that didn't go the way I projected. I tried to correct it quietly, but it's grown faster than I anticipated." He blinked once. Processing. "What do you mean, grown?" "I'm carrying debt," I said. "More than I should have taken on. If I don't restructure it soon, it could affect us." The word "us" hung in the air deliberately. For a split second, just a flicker, I saw something shift in his eyes. Not concerned. "Calculation. How much?" he asked. I gave him the number I had prepared. Significant, but not catastrophic. Enough to sting. Enough to destabilize the illusion that I was the harmless, financially neutral half of the marriage. He leaned back slowly in his chair. "That's irresponsible, Charlotte." There was no raised voice, no explosion. Just judgment. "I thought I could handle it," I said calmly. "I miscalculated." He exhaled sharply through his nose, the way he does when something disrupts his expectations. "And you didn't tell me." "I wanted to fix it first." The silence that followed wasn't supportive. It was distancing. I watched him stand and walk to the kitchen counter. He didn't look at me. He placed both hands flat on the marble, head slightly lowered, not in grief, but in frustration. "This changes things," he said finally. "Changes what?" I wanted to ask. But I didn't. Instead, I waited. He turned back toward me, face composed but colder than I had ever seen it. "I can't be tied to instability like this," he said carefully. "My career, our reputation, it all depends on structure." There it was. Structure. "I understand," I replied quietly. He studied me for a long moment, as if recalibrating who I was in this new equation. Then he said something that felt rehearsed. "Maybe this is a sign we've grown, grown in different directions." A sign. I felt no surge of anger, no desperation, only clarity expanding like cold water filling a glass. "You're saying you want to leave?" I asked, steady. He hesitated. Not because he was unsure, but because he was deciding how honest to be. "I've been thinking about it," he admitted. "And this accelerates the timeline." Accelerates, as though my perceived failure had simply confirmed a conclusion he had already been comfortable entertaining. He walked upstairs, and a few minutes later, he returned with an envelope. Prepared, printed, dated. Divorce papers. That very night. He placed them on the table between us, not dramatically, not angrily, just decisively, the moment I appeared to lose everything. He was ready to walk away, and in that quiet dining room, with the dishwasher still humming and the house exactly as it had been an hour earlier, I realized something irreversible. This wasn't about debt. This was about value, and he had just revealed how he measured mine. I didn't cry. That surprised him. I could see it in the way his posture shifted slightly, almost waiting for impact, for pleading, for disbelief. Instead, I looked down at the envelope, then back up at him. "Okay," I said. "Just that. Okay." No argument, no accusation, no attempt to renegotiate. If he was unsettled before, he didn't show it. But something in the room altered. My calm removed the friction he may have expected. "I think it's better this way," he continued, as though filling the silence that no longer felt natural. "Before things get complicated." Before, as if complication hadn't already revealed itself. "I'll review everything," I replied, "and we'll proceed properly." Properly. That word mattered to him. He nodded once, relieved perhaps that I wasn't making this difficult. He mistook composure for acceptance. What he didn't understand was this. The test was over. The result was clear. That night, after he went to bed in the guest room, his choice, framed as giving me space, I sat alone at the dining table and opened my ledger. My hands were steady. I wrote only one sentence. He chose a position over a partnership. There was no devastation in the writing. The devastation had already passed when he placed the papers down without hesitation. What remained was precision. The next morning, while he left early for work, I began moving in silence. First, I contacted the financial advisor I had met weeks earlier. "I'd like to initiate the protective review we discussed," I said calmly. Then I called a family law attorney whose name had been quietly saved in my phone for nearly a month. "I've been served," I told her. "I need a strategic response." I didn't mention that the debt was fictional. I didn't need to. The leverage wasn't the lie. It was the structure. Every asset we shared had documentation of my involvement. Years of it. Time-stamped models, email trails, signed agreements reflecting the joint strategy. His assumption that I was ornamental had never translated into legal fact. That was his first miscalculation. By midday, I had secured digital copies of all shared financial records, not to hide them, to protect them. Transparency with counsel, silence at home. When he returned that evening, he seemed almost lighter, detached, as if he had resolved a lingering inconvenience. "We should keep this amicable," he said over dinner, speaking as though discussing a business transition. "No need to make it messy." "I agree," I said. And I meant it. Messy implies chaos. This would be methodical. Over the next week, he began outlining what he believed to be fair terms. His tone was measured, even generous in his mind. "I'll make sure you're comfortable," he said one night. "Given the situation." The situation, the imagined debt. I nodded slowly, because what he didn't realize was that the imagined weakness he thought he was escaping had already exposed a deeper imbalance, one that courts take seriously. He believed he was stepping away from liability. In reality, he was stepping into evaluation. I didn't rush. I didn't escalate. I simply allowed the legal process to begin moving. He had prepared divorce papers in advance. So had I prepared understanding. Silence became my strongest position, and he still believed I was the one who had lost everything. Consequences rarely arrive with thunder. They begin with small disruptions. The first shift came during mediation preparation. My attorney requested a full financial disclosure from both sides. Standard procedure, routine. He didn't expect resistance, but what he didn't expect even more was precision. Every document he submitted, every asset allocation, every historical adjustment was met with dated records from my side. Time-stamped models, email confirmations, notes reflecting joint strategy decisions. My involvement wasn't anecdotal. It was structural. His attorney requested clarification more than once. "You were this engaged?" she reportedly asked him during one meeting. He had told her I handled the household. Technically true, just incomplete. At home, I noticed the first flicker of discomfort. "Why does your lawyer need all of this?" he asked one evening, scanning a request list. "Because we built it together," I replied calmly. He looked at me differently then. Not angrily, not warmly. Assessing. The second consequence appeared socially. Word travels carefully in communities like ours. Divorce isn't scandalous, but context matters. When friends asked gently what had happened, he repeated the version that protected him. "Financial misalignment," he said. "Different risk tolerances." Risk. An interesting word choice, but people are observant. Some of the same colleagues who once laughed at dinner tables began reaching out to me privately. "I didn't realize you were so involved in the portfolio strategy," one text read. "That diversification model was impressive." Impressive. The narrative was adjusting, not loudly, quietly. At home, tension shifted from distance to uncertainty. He had expected distress, instability, perhaps even dependence. Instead, he found me organized, composed, responsive. When the paperwork arrived, I reviewed it without visible emotion. When mediation dates were set, I confirmed availability without hesitation. One night, as he stood in the doorway of my office, he asked something he hadn't asked in years. "Are you okay?" It wasn't a concern. It was confusion. "I am," I answered. And I was, because the devastation was not the divorce. It had been the immediacy. Once that truth settled, everything else was logistics. The third consequence was internal, for him. He began revisiting numbers more carefully, recalculating exposure, realizing that a significant portion of long-term growth had originated from models I designed early in our marriage. He hadn't erased me legally. He had only erased me narratively. And narratives don't hold up well under documentation. One evening, During a particularly tense review of asset division, he said something almost involuntarily. I didn't realize how much you were doing. There was no apology in it, just dawning awareness. I met his eyes steadily. I know! That was the moment consequences became personal. Not because he was losing money, but because he was losing certainty. The certainty that he had been the singular pillar. The certainty that I was peripheral. The certainty that walking away from perceived weakness would preserve his strength. He had made a decision based on an assumption. Now he was discovering the full architecture of what he had chosen to leave. And still, he did not know the debt had never existed. That revelation was not for the courts. It was for him. And the timing had to be exact. Because consequences aren't about punishment. They're about clarity. And clarity, once delivered, cannot be undone. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. By the third mediation session, the tone had shifted noticeably. His confidence, the quiet, structured certainty he carried into the first week, had thinned. Numbers have a way of humbling people. When asset valuations were recalculated with my documented contributions included, the distribution landscape changed. Not unfairly, not aggressively, just accurately. His attorney requested a short recess at one point. Through the glass partition of the conference room, I watched them speak in low tones. His posture was different now, less expansive, more guarded. When we reconvened, he avoided eye contact. At home that evening, he lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary while I prepared tea. We don't have to do this like this, he said carefully. Like what? I asked. So, formally, as though the structure had suddenly become uncomfortable. You filed, I replied evenly. I'm responding. He nodded slowly. I just didn't expect... He stopped himself. Expect what? I asked, not pressing, just offering space. That it would be complicated. The word hovered between us. This was the same man who had told me he couldn't be tied to instability. The same man who believed structure defined strength. The same man who placed papers on the table the night he believed I had become a liability. Now the structure felt heavy. A few days later, something even more revealing happened. He asked to see the numbers again. Your debt projections, he said quietly. The restructuring plan. For the first time since that night, I saw something close to concern in his expression. Not about money, about permanence. I'm managing it, I said. But how bad is it really? He pressed. There it was. Doubt, not about my capability, but about his decision. Because if the debt were temporary, if the crisis were navigable, if the instability were not catastrophic, then what had he done? I held his gaze steadily. It was bad enough for you to leave, I said calmly. The sentence landed without accusation. He swallowed. I reacted quickly. Yes, I said. There was no anger in my voice. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Over the next week, he became quieter, less certain. He started initiating small conversations, memories, shared jokes, references to vacations we'd taken years ago. Nostalgia is often the first symptom of regret. But regret doesn't reverse decisions. One night, standing in the hallway outside my office, he said it directly. Maybe we should slow this down. I looked at him for a long moment. You accelerated it, I replied gently. He ran a hand through his hair, something he only does when control slips slightly. I thought you were hiding something bigger. I was, I said. His eyes sharpened. Bigger than the debt? Yes. He waited, but I didn't elaborate. Because the truth wasn't about finances. It was about what he had revealed when pressure appeared. Too late to fix it doesn't mean explosive regret. It means realization arriving after commitment. He had shown me who he was when he believed I was weak. And even if he now recalculated the cost, the character had already been exposed. The divorce was no longer about assets. It was about alignment. And alignment, once broken at its foundation, cannot be renegotiated by nostalgia. He had chosen a position over a partnership. Now he was beginning to understand the price of that choice. But understanding does not grant reversal. It only grants awareness. And awareness, for him, had arrived too late. The final conversation happened on a Wednesday evening. No raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums, just two adults sitting across from each other at the same dining table where everything had quietly unraveled. The divorce terms were nearly finalized. The asset division had been recalibrated fairly. My independent accounts were secured. My consultancy had grown stronger in the background. Structurally, I was stable. Emotionally, I was clear. He had asked to talk. Just us, he said. I agreed. There was something in his posture that night I hadn't seen before. Not dominance, not certainty, humility perhaps, or at least the shadow of it. I've been thinking, he began carefully, about that night. I didn't interrupt. I reacted out of fear, he said. I thought everything was about to collapse. I nodded once. I know. I felt blindsided. So did I replied gently. That made him pause. He studied my face, searching for anger he could respond to. There was none. I thought you were different, he continued. I thought you were always steady. I was, I said, until I wasn't. Silence settled between us, not hostile, just honest. He leaned forward slightly. If I had handled it differently, if I had stayed, worked through it, would this be happening? There it was. The real question. Not about money, about character. I took my time before answering. This isn't about how you handled debt, I said quietly. It's about how quickly you were ready to leave when you believed I wasn't an asset anymore. His jaw tightened slightly. That's not fair. It is! I said, still calm. You had papers prepared? He looked down. I'd been thinking about divorce for a while. I know. He looked up sharply. Can you? I knew something had shifted, I replied. I just didn't know how conditional it was. That word conditional lingered. He exhaled slowly. I never meant for you to feel replaceable. I didn't feel replaceable, I corrected gently. I felt evaluated. That was harder for him to absorb, because evaluation implies measurement, and measurement implies standards. I loved you, he said. I believe that. Then why are we still doing this? Because love that depends on performance is not partnership. I didn't say it that bluntly. Instead, I said this. When I appeared to lose everything, you didn't hesitate. That told me what you value most. He swallowed, eyes flickering with something between regret and pride. I value stability, he said quietly. I know, I replied. And you? I held his gaze steadily. I value loyalty under pressure. There was no accusation in my voice, no heat, no trembling. Just truth. He nodded once, slowly, as if finally understanding that this wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment. We sat in silence for a while longer. Then he said something softer than anything he had said in months. I underestimated you. Yes, I agreed. Not bitterly, just factually. The conversation ended without fireworks. No reconciliation, no dramatic collapse. Just two people recognized that what they built had been structurally misaligned long before the test. And once misalignment is exposed, you don't repair it with apologies. You accept it with dignity. The house feels different now, not emptier, clearer. After the divorce was finalized, I chose to keep the property, not out of sentimentality, but because it was practical and because I refused to let displacement become part of my narrative. Stability had always been something I created. There was no reason to abandon it. But I redesigned the interior, not dramatically, subtly. The dining table where he placed the papers is still here, but positioned differently. The home office has been expanded. The walls that once held neutral art now display framed architectural sketches from my early career, evidence of a woman who was never small. My consultancy has grown, not explosively, intentionally. I've taken on higher-level financial advisory collaborations alongside design work, risk strategy for boutique firms, quiet partnerships. My name appears in spaces it once did before marriage softened it into background noise. But none of that is the real transformation. The real shift is internal. I no longer confuse calmness with invisibility. I no longer believe that being low drama requires self-erasure. And I no longer perform stability for someone else's comfort. For a while, people asked carefully phrased questions. Are you okay? Was it mutual? Did something happen? I answered simply. It clarified something important. That's all. Because bitterness is loud. And I am not loud. I don't hate him. I don't even resent him. He acted according to his values. So did I. The difference is that mine were revealed under pressure, while his were revealed when pressure appeared. There's a distinction. Sometimes I replay that night in my mind. Not to relive it, but to measure my own response. The stillness, the absence of panic. The clarity arrived almost immediately after he placed the envelope down. I thought I would feel shattered. Instead, I felt awakened. The test was never about humiliating him. It was about answering a question I had avoided for years. If I appeared to lose everything, would he stand beside me? He answered honestly. And because he answered honestly, I was able to respond honestly. I chose myself. Not in rebellion, not in revenge, in alignment. There is a quiet power in walking away without rage, in restructuring your life without spectacle, in rebuilding without announcing it. I am still composed, still analytical, still calm, but I am no longer infrastructure in someone else's story. I am the architect of my own, and that difference changes everything. I've replayed that sentence in my mind many times. The moment I appeared to lose everything, he was ready to walk away. For a long time, I thought that was the most painful part. It wasn't. The most painful part was realizing I had been quietly auditioning for security in my own marriage, proving my usefulness, proving my steadiness, proving my value, without ever asking whether love required proof at all. What this experience taught me is simple, but not easy. Stability is not the same as loyalty. Competence is not the same as partnership. And love that depends on uninterrupted performance is not unconditional love. I didn't stage a financial collapse to trap him. I did it because somewhere inside, I already sensed the imbalance. I needed confirmation, not comfort. And confirmation, when it comes, can feel like loss. But clarity is not destruction, it's direction. Some people stay when storms arrive. Some people leave before the rain touches them. Neither response is accidental. Pressure reveals hierarchy, what someone protects first: reputation, money, control, or you. If you ever feel like infrastructure in someone else's life, useful, reliable, invisible, pause. Ask yourself a hard question. If you stopped performing strength, if you stumbled, if you needed support instead of providing it, would they still choose you? Not the life you maintain, not the comfort you provide. You. I don't regret the test, because it freed me from guessing. And sometimes the quietest endings create the strongest foundations for who you become next. Now I'm curious, if you were in my position, would you have run the test? Or would you have walked away without asking? I'd really like to hear your thoughts.